Good afternoon, late. Good afternoon. Thank you for just hanging in there. My name is Dr. Raj Gopalan. I am an internist by training, and I have been involved in general medicine as well as AI and machine learning for the last 30 years. So, I have done quite a bit of work on use of AI and machine learning in screening and identifying the risk for various diseases, including cancers and chronic kidney disease, Alzheimer's, and a whole bunch of stuff. But for this, I chose stroke, which is actually an acute condition. So it turns out to be that some of those statistics of stroke is just mind-boggling. As you know, every year about 12.2 million new strokes are recorded, and which means that it's about a stroke is occurring every 3 seconds. And the number has almost doubled in the last 30 years, and it's about 101 million people today are living with the aftermath of stroke. And majority of the stroke is, starts with cardiovascular disease. So cardiovascular disease is a huge risk for stroke. And one of the key factors in stroke is that early diagnosis is extremely important, as you all know. The thing is that if you delay the diagnosis by, like, for example, 1 minute of delay causes about 2 million neurons, death of neurons, 2 million death of neurons. So if you lay them end to end, it's about 7.5 miles. So as you can imagine, the amount of damage occurs to the brain if you delay. So, but unfortunately, you can only intervene when there are symptoms. But the patient may not be near a hospital, so that the valuable time is lost before a patient is transported to a hospital so that they can intervene. So it would be great if we can identify the risk for stroke even before the symptoms appear, maybe to a week before. So that will be a phenomenal help. So if you look at the cost of the stroke globally, it accounts for about $881 billion. It's almost $1 trillion. So, and what are all the risks for strokes? Elevated blood pressure, high body mass index, high fasting glucose, poor diet, and so on and so forth. So, one of the things that I use for early detection is routine blood markers. Just simple routine blood markers, which consists of total count, differential count, complete metabolic panel, and lipid panel, if it is available. So these are commonly done every 1 to 2 years during a wellness exam. So as you know, blood circulates through the body about 100,000 times a day, and it actually perfuses all the organs from the head to foot. It supplies the nutrient and takes away the toxic products for elimination. It has got tons of information, and we have hardly scratched the surface of the amount of information that is in the blood. So I'm only looking at the blood markers plus age and gender to be able to identify the risk for stroke even up to 1 week before even the symptoms appear. How can we do that? So unfortunately, what we do in practice, general practice, is that we look at the blood test results that comes out, and then we are looking individual test results and see whether any of those results are outside the reference interval, right? Even the reference interval is actually arbitrary within 50, 60 years ago, based on 100 self-declared volunteers. Who are they? Lab tech, because those are the people who can easily be accessed, right? And if you believe it or not, the reference interval doesn't reflect anybody over 60 years, because majority of the people who are sick are older people. So the reference intervals doesn't include them when they created it. So human brain cannot comprehend 30 or 40 different tests and try to figure out what is going on. So we actually look at one test at a time and look at whether it's outside the reference. If it is not highlighted, we just say that everything looks normal, you can go back home, right? So it doesn't work like that. and everybody is different. And is it possible for an AI and machine learning to kind of look at multitudes of patients who have had stroke and look at their blood results going back up to 1 week, and then train those machine, and then to be able to identify, any similarity in the profiles of the blood test to identify the risk. That is the whole idea. Okay, this is just an example of one of the models of neural net. I mean, a model for artificial intelligence and machine learning. Just to give you an example, right? You feed all those normal blood test results like hemoglobin, RBC count, WBC count, and that it spits out whether the patient has a risk for stroke or not with all the numbers. So I can go over it in detail. So how did we do that? We obtained standard, like a publicly available database of about 10,000 lab test results. Okay. We just got about divided by, 5,000 patients who never had stroke and 5,000 patients who ended up in the stroke. And we looked at their blood test results up to 1 week before, right? And we used 70% of those, which is like 7,000, like 3,500, stroke patients, 3,500 control patients who never had stroke, and trained a model, AI model, to identify whether the model will be able to identify the risk. And then the key thing about it is that when you're going to do the screening, the prevalence of stroke is only 3% in the population. So if I grab 100 people, like in that age group, middle age group, only 3 may have a risk for stroke, which means the model should be accurate enough to pick up those 3 people, right? Because I don't want to miss even one of the 3 out of 100. But it is okay because it's a screening, because there are always other things that come behind that, like CT scan, MRI, and stuff like that. So false positive is okay, but false negative is unacceptable. So that is the whole idea of this, right? So as you can see with this, so we tested it with the rest of the 3,000 patients, which has not been used at all, which the model has not even seen. Out of that 3,000, there's only like 400 people who had stroke. It picked up pretty much 91% of them. Like, so out of like 91, it only missed 8. So it actually predicted stroke for 83 of that, which is almost like 91%. We call it a sensitivity. So sensitivity is 91%. Specificity is also 89%, because since there are a lot more people who are control, it was able to predict, no stroke for 2,700 of them. Okay. So if you go and look at the other end of the column, which is called class precision, so it is able to do a negative prediction 99%, which means if the model says this patient doesn't have stroke, this is 99% sure that the patient doesn't have stroke. But the positive predictive value is not that high because the prevalence is very, very low. Okay. So I think you understand that. Okay. And then what are all the markers that the model identified as important in predicting stroke? You can look at it: sodium, chloride, gender, basophils, ethnicity, of course, absolute monocyte count, potassium, and also it has also got platelet count, bilirubin, and things like that. Okay, so the tall bar actually represents the strength of the importance of those markers, sodium, chloride. That doesn't mean that every patient will be similar to that, because every unique patient is different, because the model actually uses almost 30 different tests. So if you look at the graph, it is not a straight line or linear regression or even arithmetic regression. It is actually in a multi-dimensional separation. So that is why it's kind of complex. And the good thing about this is that with the development of AI and machine learning of recent times, you have heard about explainable AI, because as physicians, if the model says, okay, this patient has risk, this patient doesn't have risk, you got to convince the physicians why is that, right? So we have got to give explanation for it. So I've gone back and looked at each one of those markers, sodium, chloride, and basophils. There are multiple publications that have been published. The mechanism of action of sodium in predicting risk. So platelets in predicting risk, things like that. So I think I have some of those. Okay, so this is again a graph is showing that it is able to predict with 98% accuracy if the patient has stroke. And every patient is different. So it's also able to give you the markers for that particular patient that indicates the patient is high risk for stroke, like, bilirubin total, urea nitrogen, calcium. So urea nitrogen and also creatinine is extremely important for prediction of stroke because there are a number of articles that has been written about the one creatinine ratio and the risk for stroke. So it's extremely important to look at them. So the model actually picked that up. And of course, platelet is another thing because it has to be not very low or not very high. So, I mean, it should be right in the center. If it is very low or very high, then it has got a risk. So, which the physicians are going to miss because so long as it is within the border, I mean, within the reference interval, they're going to say everything is good, right? So, the reference interval is only like an arbitrary thing. So if there is a whole bunch of markers which are high normal or low normal, that doesn't mean that the patient is normal. So that is what the AI is able to pick. Okay. I have about 12 minutes, right? Or eight minutes. Yeah, 8 minutes. Okay. Okay, this is a sample patient and listed the number of markers, and I have highlighted the arrow how the difference it is in terms of certain markers. If you look at the ALT, high-risk patients has a high ALT compared to low risk. And there are articles that have been published about alanine aminotransferase and the risk for stroke, especially if it is high. And if you look at the alkaline phosphatase again, high alkaline phosphatase has a low risk. So if it is low, then it has got a high risk. Same is the case with aspartate aminotransferase. So as you can see, these are all liver enzymes. So liver enzymes is very critical in identifying the risk for strokes. And calcium, as you can see, 9.4 has a high risk compared to 7.8. As you all know, calcium gets deposited in the blood vessels. It gets kind of, loses its elasticity, can be, precursor for blockage, increasing the risk for stroke. If you look at the platelet count, 541 platelets, which is a very high platelet count, has actually a low risk compared to 338, which is also within the normal limits. So sodium, again, as you can see, high sodium has a high risk. As you can see, urea nitrogen is a huge difference in urea nitrogen between the patients who has a high risk and a low risk. So what the model does is that for a particular patients, it is able to give you the markers that are being used to identify the risk and also give the explanation for why that markers are important because it is actually from the literature. That gives you a physician a lot of convincing to be able to follow through. So does that mean that the patient who has a high risk is going to get stroke? No, because it has got a high, false positive. So which means that immediately those patients may be a candidate for doing a CT scan or an MRI, or at least watch them for any symptoms, or make them sure that they should be immediately rushed to the hospital if there are any kind of symptoms. So that gives you an addition, time to be able to move the patients to the hospital if they have a high risk. So okay. So these are some of the markers. This is an average of the markers across a multitude of patients. And as you can see, it's a big difference between the urea nitrogen, ALP, platelet count, bilirubin, calcium, ALT, creatinine, and absolute lymphocyte count for patients with the high risk for stroke. Okay, so I'll just leave these slides here because these are all the studies that have been done, published about each and every one of those markers, and I have the reference at the bottom. So there are articles that have been published with multiple studies on each of those markers that are being highlighted by the model to have the high risk for stroke. And this is the one creatinine ratio I talked about. And this is the alkaline phosphatase I talked about. There is a multiple study, Japanese study, German study. And also there is an American study, which 3 independent studies in showing the importance of ALT in stroke. And then the platelet, I talked about it. And, Rankin scale, probably people are familiar with that. A study of patients with ischemic stroke found that a higher platelet count is associated with a significant increase in the Rankin scale. And also platelet kind of helps to kind of, they do a transformation of the stroke from an ischemic to, what do you call that? A hemorrhagic stroke. So both of them can lead to stroke. From ischemia also lead to stroke, hemorrhage also leads to stroke, and platelets will transform that. So that also increases the risk. So that's why platelets is important. Okay. So I have like 4 minutes. So if you have any questions, you can ask me, or if there is any, you can go to, because I have my own consulting company called BSRM Consulting. So you can contact me for any questions. And so I think you have a question. So